regional integration, question mark. And we have in this panel, in first place, Alicia García-Herrero, Senior Fellow from Bruegel and Associate Member to Elcano Royal Institute. Welcome, Garcia. Alicia. Do you hear me?
A ver. Hola, Carlos. Hello, everybody.
Hello. Second place, Tobias Lenz from Liga Institute. And in third place, Matthias Jorgensen. He didn't arrive yet. Head of Unit Latin America of DigiTrade. In our turbulent global context, the question is if there are room to improve a new type of regional integration, specifically in the European Union and in Latin America. And we have a lot of questions regarding the first issue. First of all, how the action and the competition of the two major international actors, the US and China, affect our two regions. In second place, and regarding specifically the EU, what will happen with Brexit, the migration crisis, and the future of the Eurozone? In this context, the good news is that the outcome of the European elections and the new European Parliament doesn't allow the existence of a majority of blockade. That is a good news. But also we have questions regarding Latin America and what happens with the impact of the Venezuela crisis. Probably the Venezuela crisis is the biggest crisis in the last 2 centuries in the region. The impact could affect all the countries and the regional stability. What happened with the emergence of new governments, as in Mexico, Brazil, and the future of the Pacific Alliance on the one hand, and of Mercosur on the other? And finally, what will happen with the bilateral relation? We saw in the last years the blockade of the CELAC, and that this blockade, mainly due to the Venezuela position regarding the regional equilibriums, that this blockade frees the main and formal mechanism of the bi-regional relation, that is the EU-CELAC summit. So the question is if there are some alternatives to to back the reestablishment or the formal reestablishment of the relation. The non-formal relation goes as usual: investment, trade, academic relations, scientific relations, technology, etc. But the formal mechanism doesn't work in our days. Well, we'll begin with Alicia. Alicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. I'm going to show just a few slides. I'm going to try to make it work. Let me know if you can see the material in a second. Share screen. Let me see. So can you see the slides now? Yeah? Can you hear me? Hello.
Yes, Alicia, we hear you.
Okay, and could you see the slides, because I just stopped them? Could you see the slides? I put them back since you were not, responding. I thought it was not working. Does it work
works now,
now?
yes. It's all okay.
Okay, great. So you probably can't see me. You can only see the slides. Is that right?
We see you too.
Wow, that's impressive. I can only see my slides and not you, but that's fine. I will talk to myself for the time being. I will be very brief. I just wanted, I mean, there's so many things, Carlos, you have mentioned that it would be impossible in the available time to discuss them all. And what I'll do is I'll just focus on a couple of issues, and I leave the rest for questions and answers or interaction among the panel. So I just wanted to basically try to make the best use of my expertise. I am basically covering the impact of China in the world in the light of Latin American regional integration. And this is why I'm going to start with China's impact in regional trade integration or trade patterns, basically in the region, and then I'm going to move to WTO reform very briefly, which are the two key trade integration type of issues that I want to cover. So on the first one, I think by going through everything that has happened in terms of trade negotiations in the region while preparing this presentation, I was really impressed to see how quickly China is moving in agreeing on new free trade agreements. Of course, Chile, Costa Rica, Peru, working with Panama and Uruguay at the moment. We of course are, if we look at the number of them, further ahead, but we also know that it's taken us very long to renegotiate agreements. This would be the case of Mexico, and of course even more so in first instance the case of Mercosur. So basically, if one looks at this list, one could start to see that even in the what I would call the traditional sense of integration, or at least trade integrations through free trade agreements, China is being more agile than probably we are or others are. And I've not put in the US in this picture, focusing on China and Europe. But beyond trade agreements, and this is the key point, there's many more aspects of integration, as I'm sure there are in Europe too. We had the previous panel discussing that, but I want to really focus on China's attempts to further integrate or further collaborate or further cooperate or further profit, maybe I should say, from the region through one of its key soft power instruments so far, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. So when one looks at the map of the Belt and Road Initiative, you already have Africa in the map, but you do not yet see how quickly China has basically embarked in extending this concept well beyond this very famous map that we all know about. And basically, the countries, as you probably know, are Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela. And I'm sure Panama won't take too long to appear in this list. And on top of this relatively, I wouldn't say informal, but hub-to-spoke strategy, i.e. Bolivia with China, Chile with China, I mean, that hub-and-spoke approach to cooperation in the infra space in particular. And when I say infra, I can show you later. I don't have the slides, but if anybody's interested, I can share that most of that infra connectivity that China is financing in the region is actually energy related. 60% of China's investment in infrastructure in the region. I should actually say project finance, because it's not investment. These countries actually own the money to China, and they need to repay at some point. But 60% is energy related. So beyond that hub and spoke approach to, as I said, integration or infra cooperation, or you name it, we have to remember that there is also a more formal multilateral approach, which also relates to Latin America increasingly, notwithstanding the name of this development bank, which is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for which already Uruguay is a member, and there's a number of prospect countries in the region, and the list is very long, as you see there: Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela. So
Alicia,
very long list.
Alicia, excuse me, you should select the slides that you want to display. We mostly just see the cover slide and then just tiny thumbnails of the others. Select the slide that you want so that we can see. No, it's okay. That's why I thought someone should tell you.
Is that okay now?
Perfect.
Is that okay now? Okay, sorry about that. Thanks very much. So this is basically the first thing I wanted to say, that there is an elephant in the room. We heard that before, which is China's attempt to link Latin America to other integration cooperation projects, the most relevant one being the Belt and Road Initiative, let alone the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. And this may be behind, if you think about the list of countries I mentioned to you, kind of a different map, in a way, of potential integration even within the region. So think about, I remember I was then working in Washington, something that kind of disappeared from the map. It was basically Brazil-led, which Carlos surely remembers, and others in the room, ALCA, this idea of regional integration at the level of basically everybody in the region. Then, of course, Mexico was then negotiating NAFTA, and it kind of the whole thing, the whole ALCA project didn't work out. But there's nothing like that in the region now. And the question really is it because the region doesn't want it, or is it because there is centrifugal forces, maybe less so the US, as was the case for ALCA. I remember well that the US was not very keen on Brazil's leading role in that regional integration project, but more at this point in time, China trying to work on this hub and spoke approach, by the way, being European, not very differently from what we are seeing in Europe. And this probably would be a very interesting point of discussion later. And then I move very quickly to the second topic I wanted to cover very, very quickly, which is WTO reform. So I just picked a few of the key, or the wish list, if I may say, on WTO reform, based on a kind of a communique by a number of Latin American experts from a large number of countries at the sidelines of sorry, I said WTO reform, this is wrong, of the G20 meeting in November in Buenos Aires. So if you look at that list, what I want to do with this list is really to compare with our aspirations in Europe. We tend to believe that we're kind of in the leading role in this reform, and that we have made it very clear what we think the reform should be. And I wouldn't go as far as saying we think others should follow, but I guess many countries in the world probably would go as far as saying that. Being European, I refrain from saying that. But the point is, what are these Latin American countries expecting from WTO reform? And you start seeing some cracks compared to our aspirations. First of all, the first is obvious, transparency. But look at the second, control on subsidies, sure, but with some limits. Only the worst ones, basically. Then you look at control of unfair competitive practices of state, but also private companies. So, there's a different reading of the role of SOEs. Somehow, any company could do this. It doesn't have to be state-owned. Think about the still very relevant state-owned ownership of most energy companies in Latin America. So we think it's only China, but of course, many emerging economies have interest in keeping their state-owned ownership in strategic sectors. So, of course, they remind us that, you know, agriculture should be at the core of the reform. We tend to not to be so clear on that front. And next page, if it just serves the purpose of comparing our proposal with that of Latin American countries, at least the ones that I just referred to as key economies, I guess, representing their countries, which I could find. So we are tougher on subsidies, we're tougher on SOEs, we're tougher on digital trade, regulation of digital trade, they're tougher on agriculture, and they also mention that they would very much like to see some special treatment, but on the basis that some of them, if not all, can still be considered emerging economies. And by the way, if China claims, as we all know it does, that it should still be considered an emerging economy, for that matter, the whole region should be claiming the same thing, because by now, literally, income per capita in the country has reached for at least within the region, as Mexico is very similar to China today. So what I'm trying to say here is that how close are we in this endeavor of WTO reform? Maybe not as much as we think. And again, going back to the original intention of my presentation here, which is looking at both our Latin American regional integration, but also that with Europe. The elephant in the room, i.e. China, comes in many fronts, comes in terms of trade relations, comes in terms of investment. I covered that topic last year, so I don't want to repeat myself, but although China is not the largest by far investor in terms of stock in Latin America, not even flow of M&A, and I fully agree with Elena on this point, we are the investors, but they lend massively. They do not own the banks, with the exception of a Standard Bank in Argentina, but they lend cross-border. They lend through their policy banks for the key projects they want to invest, and these tend to be strategic projects. On the lending side, just to give you a sense, I said project finance is mainly energy. On the pure cross-border side, there is a lot of on the M&A side, there is mainly on the utility sector. And finally, there is hardly any greenfield investment from China into Latin America, while there is a lot of greenfield investment in Africa. So it's a totally different ballgame. And again, final point on WTO reform, which we could argue, well, maybe we're closer. China's influence is really creeping. It is getting there, because the expectations of a different treatment for being still an emerging economy, perhaps not so much of an issue on SOEs or subsidies, is starting to appear in the demands of Latin American countries. And I've not done the research, but I can imagine that this is true for many other emerging economies. So it's going to be tough, in a nutshell, for Europe to push for WTO reform on the basis of what we have in mind at the moment. So I leave it here, Carlos. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Alicia. And now Tobias.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to present at this panel. And I think my presentation is nicely complementary to what Alicia said. She talked a little bit about the content of the various initiatives of regional integration that we've seen in Latin America, whereas I will focus more on the institutional issues and the kind of broader structural issues that accompany Latin American regional integration. And now my intervention will focus mainly on the Pacific Alliance, but I'll talk implicitly also about other regional schemes, and we can pick that up in the Q&A. I mean, the Pacific Alliance, I think, is a good example of what is supposedly a new type of regional integration. And it has two main characteristics, which make it somewhat distinct from other Latin American integration initiatives that we know that are still around. A, it is more informal in nature. That is less strongly institutionalized, And that comes with certain advantages and disadvantages that I'm going to get into a little bit. The second key characteristic is that it is mainly, or much more than other regional organizations, oriented towards the outside, towards building bridges, mainly to the Asia-Pacific. And that also has certain advantages, but brings with it certain costs. And I want to kind of lay out the benefits and say issues or difficulties that come with the specific institutional character or nature of the Pacific Alliance. I'm going to give away my punchline and come back to it at the end. I do believe, as do many other observers, that the Pacific Alliance is a promising tool, especially to connect Latin America economically with some of the countries in the Asia-Pacific. But at the same time, I also want to suggest that it will have to change as it moves forward. It's unlikely to stay and maintain the same characteristics that it has now. Okay, on my first point. So the Pacific Alliance is largely an informal organization. And that basically means kind of two things. One is that it is placed or based on explicitly shared expectations and understandings about what the purpose of the organization is, but it's not really rooted in formal treaties or based in international law to the same extent than our other regional organizations. So the PA, as you know, was inaugurated in 2011 by the convention of the 4 presidents of Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico. And the common purpose of the initiative was basically to achieve the free movements of goods, services, capital, and labor among the 4 countries. Yet these expectations, as I briefly mentioned, are not really codified in international law, with the partial exception of the framework agreement signed in 2012. But really the organization evolves through a sequence of presidential declarations and other types of non-binding documents, such as memoranda of understanding, that respond in large parts to political expediency. So in many ways, the organization is carried forward by the political will of the highest leaders of these 4 countries. It's largely based on regular meetings between high-level officials, the presidential summits being an important part. There's also a Council of Ministers, which encompasses foreign ministers as well as ministers of the economy, as well as a whole range of working groups, 25 by now, that regularly meet and kind of agree on the substance of cooperation. But none of this is really legally binding in the sense of international law. And then finally, the organization is not heavily institutionalized, as this implies. It does not have a regional secretariat, for example. It does not have an institutionalized dispute settlement arrangement like Mercosur does, like the Andean community does. So it's a very intergovernmental coordination mechanism with a key role played by the rotating presidency. And this informal institutional structure has some advantages. The primary one of which is that it's more flexible, right? It's much easier to kind of change the procedures and also the substance of cooperation in such a shallowly institutionalized arrangement than it would be in a more heavily institutionalized one. Decision-making speed is generally quicker. Because fewer actors are involved, and adjustments to changing political priorities is also easier. In addition, there's fewer or lower organizational costs. You don't have to pay the salaries of bureaucrats and tribunals or general secretariats. And important also in the Latin American context, it's easier to maintain national sovereignty. So the informal arrangement that the PA is largely sovereignty preserving. That is, it only moves as fast as the slowest member among the 4 states is willing to proceed, right? All decisions are taken by consensus or unanimity. There is no independent agents that interfere with the pure will of the political actors in that process. So it maintains national sovereignty. I think the main, and these are important advantages, especially at a time when the political context, both within Latin America but also worldwide, is kind of rather volatile. Things happen quickly, crises come and go, and in that context it's quite useful to be able to react quickly to emerging challenges and changing priorities, right? The main disadvantage that I see of this type of structure, which makes me think that it'll be difficult to maintain such a low level of institutionalization, is that the success of the arrangement depends very much on the cohesiveness of the political group or the member states themselves. So to operate on the basis of non-binding agreements, largely non-binding agreements, driven forward by agreements with among the presidents of the member states, means that the presidents themselves have to agree on the basic ideas and purposes of the organization. So as soon as a single state changes its priorities, becomes more skeptical, say, of the free trade outlook that the PA tries to promote, that type of institutional structure is very quickly in the danger of being stalled. I mean, take an example of Duque's election in Colombia in 2018, who was very skeptical of signing additional free trade agreements, right? He put a stop on that policy, which meant that Colombia, at least temporarily, withdrew from the negotiation of additional associated memberships in the Pacific Alliance. And so these types of organizations function well when the group is cohesive and the main political actors share a similar ideological outlook. When that changes and you've got different political ideologies sitting around the table, decision-making becomes much more difficult. And stalemate is imminent in that case. So much for the informal side. Now, at the outset I said that the second main characteristic of the Pacific Alliance is that it is oriented towards the outside, much more than towards the inside. Generally, the main goal is to facilitate trade or provide public goods within the organization. Think of Mercosur, the Andean Community, etc. Now, the Pacific Alliance is explicitly outward-oriented and wants to build bridges, economic bridges primarily, between Latin America, the Pacific countries, but also other Latin American states and the Asia-Pacific region. So after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, Pacific states kind of recognized that economic growth and economic opportunity was going to come more from Asia, potentially, than from North America and Europe. And so this is part of a broader, say, redirection of outlook and connections between Latin America. It's based on a strategy of economic insertion that's quite well known in Latin America, based on attracting foreign direct investment through trade agreements and economic liberalization. And it contains kind of an interesting element that my colleague at the GIGA, Detlef Nolte, has called nation branding. So besides trade facilitation, it also aims to advocate the participating states as being attractive in terms of foreign direct investment. And they do that through a series of kind of small initiatives like joint business and investment promotion activities, like a common stock market that they've created, like shared embassies abroad, etc. Besides these small activities, a big part of the strategy of the PA are different types of memberships that they have with countries outside the organization. And by now there's two separate categories from member states, proper speaking. One is the status of so-called associated states. Currently there's 4 of them, namely Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore. And this status established the possibility that other states could join the PA as partners with which the PA would have a trade agreement, a free trade agreement, based on the standards established by the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. And then finally, there's a whole range of observers with which the PA seeks closer economic cooperation, but short of a full-fledged trade agreement itself. And there's 57 economic observers at the moment, including the EU. Now, once again, I think that economic outlook, or that outward orientation, let's put it that way, has certain advantages. Maybe the most immediate one of which is that a liberal economic outlook, a bridge-building outlook, is valuable in and of itself at a time when economic protectionist ideas and policies are on the rise in many parts of the world. There's also long-standing debates on the economic impediments to regional integration in Latin America, the lack of economic complementarities. Many of the participating countries are based in selling or exporting primary commodities with relatively little value added. So there's certainly value in kind of reaching out further and not confining themselves to a region in which economic integration, trade liberalization by itself has been unable to fulfill the promises that have often been associated with this. And I think a final advantage of the specific focus on economic issues is that the organization has been relatively unaffected to date by the political turmoil in the region, right? I'm thinking here of the Venezuelan crisis, which has torn the UNASUR in shreds, which has really let Mercosur suffer, but the PA seems to have emerged relatively untarnished from the Venezuelan crisis. And I think that's partially due by its very specific, kind of relatively narrow focus. Now, the main problem that I see with the current type of outward orientation is that the PA has been able to seize the opportunity, or has been able to move swiftly into the vacuum left by the trade tensions between the US and China, the decline of APEC, the abandonment of the TPP, and kind of they've used that opportunity smartly in order to develop their own strategy of cooperation with Asia-Pacific economies. That's been good. The question is, what's going to happen after? I mean, APEC is not dead, and we don't know what's going to happen to the TPP if the president in the United States changes again towards a more economics-friendly president eventually. So is the PA in its economic or in its cooperation profile really distinct enough from other or regional organizations in the region in order to be able to make it survive after APEC and maybe TPP are potentially resurrected, right? There I have doubts. I don't really see how the PA is really distinct from other economic initiatives in the region. So let me conclude by kind of pulling together these two threads. I mean, I think a major value looking more towards Latin America itself is that it integrates Mexico more with the Latin American region. And if it manages to build a bridge, say, to Mercosur, then this would link the two largest economies in the region, which is certainly a big asset. At the same time, and Carlos probably knows this much better than I as an historian of Latin America, I cannot really think of any historical examples, and the history of Latin America is very rich in all kinds of regional integration initiatives over many decades, of where kind of an informal organization has really survived over long stretches of time. My impression is that there's kind of historically seen two options for these types of agreements. Either they're eventually abandoned and they kind of disappear because they don't manage to bridge potential disagreements that exist between the member states, right? That would be LAFTA and ALADI and some of the arrangements like these. Or they become more institutionalized over time. And here I think Mercosur, it's still seen as being very little institutionalized, which I think is right, but it's more strongly institutionalized than the PA is. And I remember in the early 1990s, the debate in Mercosur was very similar to the one in the PA now. We're going to focus only on trade. We're not going to have institutions because these only hamper flexibility. And look at where Mercosur has come since. So I fear that in order to kind of stay around, the PA will have to change and probably become more institutionalized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tobias. Finally, we have a bilateral panel. Alicia spoke about the China impact in Latin America and Tobias about the Pacific Alliance. I have two questions, one for Alicia, another for Tobias. For Alicia, it is clear that the main relation between China and Latin America is based in bilateral relations, state by state. There are no room today for global or bi-regional relation. The EU-LAC China summit failed. We haven't any output from these summits. So my question is, how or what role could play China in the integration of Latin America? And from Tobias, you mentioned Mercosur and the Pacific Alliance, but as you speak mainly about the Pacific Alliance. We have today many initiatives about a possible convergence between the two institutions, the Mercosur on the one hand and the Pacific Alliance in the other hand. It's very difficult, but what do you think about this process of convergence between the two institutions? And regarding the idea of the impact of the lack of coherence in the governments of the Pacific Alliance, my idea is different, because up to now, and excluding the Mexico case and the emergence of López Obrador as president of Mexico, the Pacific Alliance survived many change of governments in all the countries. In Peru, Alan García, Humala, etc. In Colombia, Uribe, Santos, Iván Duque. But in Chile, you have Piñera, Bachelet, and Piñera another time, and they survive. In other Latin American integration systems, they fail. When they change governments, and the ALBA case is more clear, they fail. So it's true that now, with the emergence of López Obrador, the future of the Pacific Alliance is not so clear, but what is the real situation? Okay, Alicia, you first, please.
Okay, so is China fostering regional integration? That's your question. Well, it doesn't have a straight answer. I guess if I narrow it down to cross-country infrastructure projects, the answer is yes, to some extent. In fact, I was looking at the number of projects. There's a Trans-Pacific fiber optic cable that China is financing in Chile. There's also a number of railways connections, the bioceanic railway connection between Peru and Brazil. So, there's a number of cross-border projects that China is trying to finance. So if I were to stop the answer here, it would be yes, to some extent on the infra space. But going back to what I said about the Belt and Road Initiative, I, being a hub and spoke approach to to soft power, much more than a multilateral Bretton Woods type approach, which the US has been following for many, many years, the answer would be no. And this is basically quite evident by looking at what China has been doing in other parts of the world. So if you look at the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, for example, it basically links Pakistan from south, from Wadar all the way to China, to Xinjiang province, but it doesn't really, sorry to say, not care, because I guess it's very difficult to do that. Link Pakistan to Afghanistan is very, is very, very risky, as you can imagine. But the point is, and this is just in the mind of China's, I guess, China not yet being the global power that the US has always been, thinks bilaterally. It doesn't really, it hasn't gotten to the point of thinking multilaterally. It may get there, but not yet. And there's many other examples. One would be Europe. Maybe to make things easier, China regionalizes a strategy. This is the 16+1, because there are too many small countries in Europe to deal with. But it might not necessarily be an integration strategy, but rather a sum of individual countries on which to apply a hub-and-spoke approach. So that would be my reading of what's happening in the region, and thus I don't think China will foster integration, because China is not Europe. Europe is, in a way, born with integration. China is a unified entity, and thus doesn't understand this idea of regional integration. So it's just natural that it doesn't really.
Thank you, Alicia.
You asked two questions. One was on the convergence between the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur. I know that everyone advocates this, so rhetorically there's clear agreement between the major actors that this ought to happen. I think at the practical level there's good reasons why they haven't really moved much beyond rhetoric so far. And that is, Mercosur would basically have to abandon its common external tariff if it wanted to converge with the Pacific Alliance. And even though there's been much debate over individual tariffs as part of that common external tariff, it has survived for almost 30 years now, for good reasons. The smaller economies do kind of benefit from being part of that larger market, whereas Brazil was largely in a position to make its own common external tariff be applicable to the whole group of countries. So for Brazil, it's also a tool of regional governance, if you want, with its membering states. And Macri and Bolsonaro have been clear about wanting to abandon this, but they haven't really followed up in action. I think there is good reasons why they haven't really followed up in action, because the price that Mercosur would have to pay in terms of its own economic cohesiveness, also towards the outside, would be rather large, I think. And the question about the value added of Mercosur, if it abandons the common external tariff, would pose itself to Mercosur as it does already and will probably more so in the future to the Pacific Alliance. In a world in which there's many free trade agreements, right? What makes Mercosur really distinct then from other free trade agreements if it gives up on that common external tariff? So I think convergence is more difficult than might appear kind of at first sight and than rhetoric really suggests. On the second question, why has the PA survived while other regional organizations have collapsed when governments change? That's, I think, a tough one, but I would say there's two main reasons. One is that despite changes in governments, there has been a basic consensus, or that there has continued to be a consensus on the basic ideological orientation of the organization as such. So the very fact that this should help to connect the Pacific Rim economies towards its Asian Pacific counterparts has largely remained consensual among the the main players despite changes in governments. And I think that has carried the organizations, let's say, through hard times. That's one reason. The second reason is that it has to do with the substance of cooperation in the organization. It's very easy to maintain the low-level type of activities that that much of the PA's substance is based on, even in face of economic or ideological divergence, right? You can always go on a joint investment promotion tour in the Asia Pacific, even if you disagree on other social policy or economic issues, or putting together and pooling resources when it comes to embassies is something that's easily maintainable, so to speak, even in the face of ideological divergence. And at the same time, negotiating a range of free trade agreements is not so time sensitive. So that is to say, you can negotiate an agreement, and when you don't continue with that due to ideological divergences, you just wait a couple more years till you negotiate the next one, right? It's not so. The type of cooperation that the PA fosters is not so dependent on continuous type of activities than other organizations may be. And therefore, it's been easier for the organization, I think, also to survive in times when the governments themselves disagreed.
Thank you, Tobias. Well, finally, we have a trilateral panel and no a bilateral. Thank you, Matthias. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you. And first of all, my apologies for having come late. But we've had a change of management in DD Trade. We've got a new Director General, and she's calling meetings at all moments and of all durations. I'm sorry, I was a bit late. So I'm unfortunately not able to build on and take into account what has been said until now. But I also apologize if I repeat something. But I think what I would want to do is to offer you a couple of short comments on how we, from a trade policy point of view, see the issue of regional integration in Latin America. And we probably do have some basis upon which to speak, because we have, as you know, tried to engage with Latin America very much on the basis of regional integration, existing regional integration schemes, with successes in some instances, and maybe with less success in other instances. But I think, first of all, from our side, in DD Trade, we have as a part of our policy towards and our policy interaction with Latin America, had to deal with regional integration as an important element, and we have done that because we have been supporting, as part of a larger EU, regional integration for a number of years, of course, in Latin America, partly because Latin America wanted it themselves, and partly also because of the vocation of the EU to support regional integration schemes in the world when these occurred, and of course also in the Caribbean. The second reason was that in order to negotiate free trade agreements, we felt that in certain instances it was better to negotiate with groups rather than with individual countries. You know, we have individual agreements with Chile or Mexico, for example, but when it came to Central America and when it came to the Caribbean, we felt that the critical mass for negotiating would only be obtained in case there was a joint negotiation. It would simply be too complicated for us in terms of negotiation, taking it through the Parliament, and in terms of also of administrating afterwards agreements, if we would have had an individual agreement with each of the Central American countries, for example.
So we have negotiated with the regional blocs, which chose to negotiate with us, or with whom we more or less also maybe imposed a bit our wish to negotiate as a bloc. And I think if we look at it, we can see that things have gone well, or has had certain consequences in some instances, and have maybe not necessarily been facilitative of the process. But let's be concrete. I think with Central America, it was success. Central America was able to attract the attention of the EU to negotiate with us, and we feel that what we have done there has contributed to regional integration. Panama has got a bit closer to CIECA, for example, and in terms of the implementation of the agreement, it has been quite efficient. I mean, we've had yearly meetings with all 6 Central American countries, and it has worked fairly well. With the Andean community, it was a bit more difficult. The Andean community started out and saying, well, we'll have an association agreement negotiation with the EU. Then rather fast, Bolivia thought that that was not such a good idea because of change of regime. Ecuador also left the party a bit later in 2010. And we were then left with a agreement, or with a negotiation with 2 countries to which we adapted quite rapidly to make a multi-party agreement with Colombia and Peru, which I think then, in terms of, shall we say, the broader policy objective of regional integration was successful, because we had a very good agreement with the 2 countries, quite pragmatic. It's an agreement, a multi-party. So differently from the agreement we have with Central America, it's not the same customs tariffs for these 2 countries. But it did the job. It was, however, quite complicated for us institutionally. We had to change horses, so to speak, in the middle of the river. We had to get a new negotiation mandate. We were probably doing some institutional acrobatics, which it would not be possible for us to do today. But then Ecuador joined, and now we understand that Bolivia might also consider joining. That's at least some of the signals we've heard from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there. And these negotiations were fairly time efficient and resource efficient, I think. Let's now look at Mercosur. I think Mercosur has certainly been a challenge as a negotiation. It's been a challenge, of course, because of the well-known sensitivities that you all know in terms of agriculture. But I think it's also really been complicated for us to have a negotiation with a partner which is made up of such different players: a giant, a somewhat big adolescent, and 2 very small players, and with very different interests, very different sensitivities, and without a real history of successfully negotiating agreements with other countries. I think we're speaking Chatham House rules, yeah, right? Yeah, that's good.
No, this is not. Sorry.
Is it on the record?
On the record, yeah. It's being streamed. You're stuck.
Okay. Right. I can see the number of embassies here, but okay. But I think I'm being fairly. I'm not saying anything which is a secret. But I think it's really been quite complicated to have this negotiation with Mercosur, and I think part of it has been that there has been quite four different countries, different in size, and also quite different in political cycles. And we've had that situation, of course, and when we've had, in the space of the time that we've negotiated with Mercosur, well, we've actually had one agreement with Mexico, and we've modernized that agreement. So that's certainly something we're able to say, well, has this idea of a regional integration really been useful? or facilitative for their relations with us, I think that's a question. Now, looking at the future, I mean, we can see the regional integration is something that continues in Latin America and the Caribbean. Regional integration bodies emerge and they die. ALBA, at a certain moment, was a regional integration initiative. It doesn't look as if it's so active today. There's the Pacific Alliance now, which is there, and which we are thinking about for several years now what we should do with, because there's a lot of commonalities, but it's also countries with all of which we have free trade agreements. So we've been dancing a bit about the hot pot there and say, well, what should we do with the Pacific Alliance? And I think the question is still out there. We've just agreed a memorandum of understanding with them, or a joint declaration that we will collaborate further. But in terms of trade, I think the question is really out there. What should we do more? What can we do more than what we're actually already doing through these agreements? And I think then there's the last question on regional integration, which is really in the meta level. Latin America and the Caribbean, do they feel that they should use regional integration as an instrument for engaging with the world and with other partners as a region as such, or is it too big and unwieldy, and are the differences inside Latin America and Caribbean simply too big for them to be efficient? CELAC for us, I think, as a DG Trade, as a trade policy interlocutor, has been quite useful. This idea that you bring together leaders, that you bring together trade ministers, that you bring together ministers of foreign affairs on a regular basis is something that has, to a very large extent, created spaces of communication, spaces of encounters, also between maybe the partners and the players on each side, which don't normally come into touch with each other. We don't have these meetings so much for a couple of years, because CELAC at least has decided not to engage so much with the EU on the level of leaders. And I think that's an issue which we need to take into account. We have less channels of communication that we have before, and I think that's a bit of a shame. Negotiation and interest come from knowing each other, and to know each other, you need to talk to each other. And for the moment, we don't have all the channels that we had before, and maybe not all the channels that the relation deserves, and also in a situation in which both Latin America and the EU is occupied, or maybe preoccupied somehow, with its relations either to Asia and China or to the US. So that's just a couple of introductory remarks.
Thank you, Matthias. It's true that you said that now CELAC is paralyzed, and so make a lot of problems to the bi-regional relation. But you spoke also about Mercosur and the EU-Mercosur negotiations. This morning, Edita Herta spoke about the same thing, and he said that in her regards, a positive conclusion of the negotiation could be, but she hasn't all the clues in her hands. What's your opinion about these negotiations? Do you think that it's possibly a happy end, or we made regarding a new year, next year in Jerusalem?
I think there is Now, let's say, where are we now? Where have we come from and where are we now? I think people say this has been a very long negotiation, and it's true, it's been very long. It started in 1999 or 2000. That depends a bit upon how you see the process. But it is also true that for a number of years, a considerable number of years, there were no meetings, or there was no real progress. That's quite clear, and I think that reflects the fact, as I said, that complicated negotiation partners on both sides, and also I think very different expectations on what this negotiation would result in on each side. However, I think since 2016. We've really seen a step change in this negotiation. There has been, I think, more. There's been stronger interest in Mercosur to open up and to see their possibility of an agreement, to see an agreement with the EU as a possibility to gain market access, to lock in reform, and to reform their economies. I think that's one factor. And on the other side, I think particularly on our side, it's clear that since 2016, in particular since 2017, it's clear that the international trade relations, multilateral trade relations, which are in a real moment of crisis, I would like to underline that, we are in a real moment of crisis when it comes to multilateral trade relations, are more uncertain. So there's an interest in strengthening and creating the kind of the basis for rules-based trade with Mercosur that we believe is really something fundamental and highly beneficial for us in our relations with third countries. There is, I think there's been good progress since 2016. You know that there are some difficult issues out there. We have some very important needs from our sides when it comes to the trade area. They are not secrets. You've seen them from the public reports which exist from the negotiation meetings, in terms of maritime transport, in terms of market access for industrial goods, in terms of market access for agricultural goods, in terms of geographical indications, maritime services, I said, on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is a legitimate expectation from the side of Mercosur to also have this deal be worth its while, in terms of market access to the EU, and I think the key questions are really quite clear now. There's also, I think, an understanding that there's a window of possible opportunity, which will close fairly soon, because it's election time in Argentina, it's election time in Uruguay very soon. It's with change of guard in Europe with the Commission. So if we want to do it, it should be now. I think there's a lot from this to gain from both sides, but to go the final mile, I think it will take real political decisions from each side, because it's clear that neither we nor Mercosur will want to conclude an agreement which is unilateral, or which is not balanced in its components. We have always say, and we have always agreed with Mercosur, that what we need to conclude is a balanced, comprehensive, and ambitious agreement. It's something that we need to be able to sell to our stakeholders, the Council, the Member States, and our industry, our consumers, and it's also something that needs to be ratified in the side of Mercosur. And I think if you go into a negotiation with that kind of perspective, and we are working together with Mercosur, which are just as democratic as we are, well, I think those are very important perspectives. I'm hopeful, but well, I'm optimistic. That's something else, I think. But it's clear for me that there is a possible window of opportunity. I think there's a strong commitment from both sides. There's a willingness to work, and those are already the basic ingredients for trying to move forward. Whether we'll be able to really do it, we'll have to see.
Thank you, Matthias. That is a good way to put an end to this panel. Thank you very much, Alicia. Good luck. And thank you all. Bye.